So now let's get into some of the features here. So when we're looking at PBCS, one of the biggest pieces here is when we talk about plan types and dimensionality. So when you're thinking about PBCS here, what we really try to do when we implement an application, for an organization is try to understand, a purpose-based build. So what I mean by that is really trying to define plan types that include a specific, piece of information or specific dimensions here. So the example that we have here on the PowerPoint slide is this organization maybe tracking something for spend. So let's say, from an operational perspective, you may have plants and warehouses and tracking the expenses that are being incurred at those physical locations. And then maybe you also want to have a different plan type where you're tracking detailed SKU level products and materials. And ultimately, it would be nice to report both of those at once, but the forecasting and budgeting process is independent. So in this case, we actually have a plan type for spend and a plan type for material, and then we're combining them into one reporting plan type so that you're basically inputting your forecast and budget and running calculations in your spend and material plan types respectively, and ultimately you're providing all of your reporting and dashboarding out of your reporting plan type. So this also means that there are different dimensions that exist in each of these plan types. So you can see that you can really customize an environment to be tailor fit for any type of organization, especially outside of finance here. Leading on to the next feature of PBCS that I think lends itself very well to the nature of outside of finance here is the input process as a whole. So one thing here with PBCS is the input process is simplified. So you can use the simplified interface to really streamline a lot of this input process. And so when you think of maybe the user base that may be accessing PBCS outside of finance, you may be talking about people like marketing directors or plant controllers. They certainly don't want a tedious input process. PBCS really brings it full circle for them and provides an engaging environment so that they can input their data in a simple format and have calculations run as they submit data on the fly, doing all sorts of operations that fit the business's needs. So through PBCS, you're really getting that simplified input process that can really help drive value to the end users as well as the organization, especially from outside of a finance perspective. So that leads on to the next piece here when we talk about calculation enhancements within PBCS. This is something that we have been very pleased with throughout our testing. A few years ago, some of you on the call may remember Oracle really pushing the Exalytics servers. This is really a server that is driving its calculation engine, all in memory, really built for speed. Some of the challenges when implementing Exalytics on-prem, in the past few years have been, able to configure it correctly so that it's always working as expected. So in some cases, we had clients that were going to Exalytics boxes and they were not seeing the performance increases that they were hoping for. And 9 times out of 10, that was because the server wasn't configured, as they needed to. Well, in PBCS, because you don't have any ownership of that server itself, Oracle is really running that for you. It is tuned exactly like it needs to be, and so any of the calculations that you're running in PBCS are running off of Exalytics, and we have found performance to be very good and been very pleased with this. I think that's a huge win for PBCS. The next thing when we talk about calculations here are really the ability to reuse, kind of what we're building. So, the screenshot here is simply kind of a view from a development standpoint of what a business rule code would kind of look like step by step here. If you went to a script icon there, you'd see much more detail behind the scenes. But this is an example of how you can kind of start creating templates within your business rules so that there is pieces of code that you want to reference multiple times over in multiple calculations. You can continue to reference those and not have to rebuild them from scratch every time. The next piece here is really when we have multiple calculations that you want to coordinate in an execution. We can coordinate that with rule sets so that multiple business rules can be run in a specific order to provide the end state that's desired by the organization here. So I think the big win here is really the Exalytics piece in the back end. Again, performance has been very good through our testing, and I think that's a huge win, especially when we're talking about outside of finance when you may have large data sets. Continuing with the theme of data and data movement here, Smart Push is functionality that's available in PBCS that can really help streamline your data between those different plan types. So what this can ultimately do for an organization or for a department is kind of eliminate that reporting lag. So oftentimes, environments are set up with multiple applications or multiple databases throughout, and maybe some sort of summarized way to view that data, using Smart Push can actually integrate the input process with the data movement, so that you will never have to worry about your reporting cube or your reporting database being out of sync compared to your input ones. So if you think about our first slide we looked at with plan types there, there are processes that we can set up with Smart Push where when end users are inputting data into the spend plan type or the materials plan type, that data would automatically be sent to the reporting plan type. One nice piece here too is that it's very customizable, so you can define the data scope. So oftentimes, the scope of that data may be the context of the input form that has been built, for the Smart Push. But let's say there are allocations or calculations that happen after the input process that expands the overall data set that we want to push to the reporting cube. We can also define that data scope to be outside of simply the context of that form. So really a good opportunity to integrate the entire PBCS environment and make sure, again, that your reporting is always aligned with your input process. So I know this is very cool functionality that we've had good results with through our testing and very satisfied with so far. And again, the Smart Push piece is also leveraging the Exalytics server on the back end. So speed has been something that's definitely been built for. Another feature that's independent to PBCS here is the concept of sandboxing. I know, especially in any organization, but outside of the Office of Finance, there may be many opportunities for what-if modeling, right? Maybe you're looking at commodities and data sets like that, where you want to put together a lot of different what-if scenarios to be able to report to your leadership team and give them different looks and feels of kind of what you're projecting the data to look like, in the end state. Well, in the past, you would have had to coordinate with IT or your finance systems team to help set up, kind of what-if versions, new forms, things like that. In this case, you can actually create sandbox dynamic what-if scenarios on the fly, which is really nice. And then after you start to use your sandbox for different versioning, and you decide that you want one of those to be your ultimate reporting metric, you have the ability to then actually publish that and make that the actual data set itself. So pretty cool functionality here. Again, I think it can lend itself very well to either finance or outside the Office of Finance, but I think some pretty cool functionality here, within PBCS that you really can't get anywhere else. Valid intersections is another piece that for PBCS can really lead to more of a less maintenance type environment here. And so what valid intersections entail are essentially kind of the ability to define relationships between multiple dimensions. So, maybe there are certain products or certain materials that are only valid for, plants X, Y, and Z. You can actually define that in the back end here, and that can really lead to your data forms then being more dynamic as a whole. So you could actually even set up an environment within PBCS where, through valid intersections, you could really come pretty close to having, only, a couple different form formats that would work for the entire organization or, the entire department, however your PBCS application is built. But the concept of these valid intersections is definitely newer functionality that I think lends itself well to a best practice design environment. And again, the key thing here is I think it really leads to less maintenance overall. Kind of makes for a more dynamic environment. So task lists. Those of you who are familiar with legacy Hyperion planning, you're probably looking at this slide and thinking to yourself, why are they talking about task lists? And normally I would tend to agree with you. I think traditionally task lists, although they can be helpful if your business process is aligned in a certain way where it is kind of role-based, where one analyst has to input for this piece of the forecast, and then the next analyst has to take that data and interpret it to move on and build onto the forecast. It can work, but I think we oftentimes find that in most organizations, many of the analysts and employees are wearing many different hats, right? So it's probably not really eye-popping functionality here. But in PBCS, one thing that's very cool is they have added the administration type task lists. So from a back-end perspective, there obviously are tasks that need to take place for monthly maintenance or kind of moving from one forecast cycle to the next, things like that. You can actually develop task lists here for the administrator of your system so that they basically have a checklist of what they have to go through every single month or every single plan cycle. And those can be things like adding members, updating valid intersections, running specific business rules for copies, refreshing databases. So things that were never available on the legacy planning side are now available in PBCS, which really allows for kind of a one source of truth for your documentation for your administrator of the system. So I think that this is a very cool functionality, oftentimes overlooked, but I think it's very important to touch on, and I think, again, can really bring you that one source of truth, for your administrator of the system. So I mentioned, on one of our first slides around why choose PBCS. I would say this is one of the nicest features of PBCS is the fact that you're always getting the latest and greatest. So we wanted to share with you kind of what that process looks like. So if you are a PBCS customer, your organization has PBCS, and let's say you're the administrator or owner of that environment, and there can be more than one defined, you would receive an email like this from Oracle on a monthly basis. In this case, we're looking at the email we received in September here. So it's basically just telling you that your test environment will be updated on date X, and we will release that into production, later in the month. So this really gives you an opportunity then to open up the documentation they send you, and this is kind of what that looks like. They provide a nice table of contents going through, and kind of announcing the new features and updates within PBCS, and they have that then in your test environment first, so that you can check it out. You kind of see how that impacts your environment, maybe see some new features that you might want to leverage, and then you have an opportunity to test that out in your non-production environment, so that you can become ready for when it hits production. They also, I've seen recently they've done a little bit of an upgrade to the overall new features and updates Oracle site, and there are even videos for some of this now too. So a very streamlined way to identify the changes and implement them into your environment, which is a very, very nice thing for the end users as well as the administrators of the system. So the last piece I just kind of wanted to show here quick is the different type of operational reporting that can become available from PBCS. So the first screenshot here on the left is really a smart view, ad hoc retrieve. So those of you who are familiar with on-prem planning in Essbase, you probably really like SmartView. Don't worry, SmartView is still there for you. You can still access SmartView and do your planning ad hoc just like you would in the past. And I think this is a really good way, especially for more savvy users to get in there and do some ad hoc reporting, leverage the dimensionality to kind of slice and dice any way they see fit. Also a great tool for kind of finding that needle in the haystack, right? So if you're looking for something specific, very easy to kind of narrow that down with the variety of SmartView options that are on hand for you. This middle screenshot shows the built-in dashboarding that's inherent in PBCS. So this is very cool. So you no longer need a separate dashboarding tool to throw on top of your budgeting and forecasting tool. You have it built into PBCS, which are very easy to build and can very present themselves well to leadership, obviously. And then this last piece here is a financial report. So those of you who are familiar with kind of legacy EPM environments, traditionally this is going to be your FR reports that you publish via PDF. Maybe you do some email batching as well, but this really kind of shows the full gamut then of reporting. And from an operational perspective, you can see by leveraging all three of these at once, it really enhances your overall reporting suite and really helps kind of streamline that overall. So I really kind of walked through a lot of the key and important features that we feel are critical to considering when you're evaluating PBCS, especially from an operational perspective or outside of finance. Now I'm going to pass that over to Bob here as kind of our integration specialist, and he's going to walk you through a lot of the functionality that you have as far as integrating with the